The distinction between crimes that are inherently wrong and those that are merely prohibited by statute forms the foundation for understanding certain acts as demanding perpetual accountability. Crimes classified as malum in se are recognized as wrongs in themselves because they violate fundamental principles of human dignity and moral order. These acts stand apart from malum prohibitum offenses, which derive their wrongfulness solely from legislative enactment. The concept of radical evil extends this framework by identifying transgressions that undermine the conditions for human plurality and moral reconciliation. Such offenses render forgiveness conceptually untenable while still requiring punishment, establishing a category of acts that transcend ordinary temporal boundaries in legal accountability. Imprescriptible crimes emerge from this philosophical foundation as offenses exempt from any statute of limitations. Treason and murder carry no statute of limitations under federal and state law when elements are met, while child abuse, particularly when involving medical or coercive interventions on minors, receives elimination or substantial extension of limitations periods in many jurisdictions. Non-sexual physical and medical child abuse follows standard felony limitations, but elevates to no statute of limitations when resulting in death or qualifying under broader harm definitions. The analysis of the COVID pandemic reveals the necessity for an event-specific jurisprudential framework to delineate crimes within crimes. The pandemic functions as a crime in and of itself while generating conspiratorial planning, direct criminal acts, and spillover or cascading effects. The framework labels these as COVID crimes, with individual acts designated as COVID treason, COVID murder, or COVID child abuse. All such designations carry no statute of limitations, ensuring perpetual accountability for the full chain of activity. The COVID pandemic begins the sequence as a coordinated set of policies that centralized power and restricted rights. These policies encompass conspiracy to amplify parameters through long-term networks, direct imposition of mandates and restrictions, and spillover coercion that affected subsequent societal structures. Within this structure, every actor receives designation under the framework. Specific conduct receives labels of COVID treason when undermining constitutional order, COVID murder when resulting in harm with malice, or COVID child abuse when targeting minors. The designations apply uniformly to conspiracy, direct acts, and spillover. No statute of limitations attaches to any labeled act. This structure delineates crimes within crimes and maintains perpetual accountability across the parameters of the pandemic response, including mask mandates and vaccine policies. Philosophical and legal foundations of imprescriptible COVID crimes. The philosophical foundations of malum in se and radical evil support the development of an event-specific framework for the COVID pandemic. Crimes classified as malum in se are inherently evil acts that demand punishment regardless of statutory declaration. These offenses violate fundamental human dignity and the shared moral order that sustains society. Murder, coercion that destroys autonomy, and interventions that harm the vulnerable exemplify malum in se because they are recognized as wrong across societies without need for legislative prohibition. Radical evil extends the malum in se framework by designating acts that destroy the conditions for human plurality and moral reconciliation. Such offenses attack spontaneity and the shared world of distinct individuals, rendering forgiveness ethically untenable even when punishment remains obligatory. The statute of limitations establishes a legislatively enacted temporal boundary beyond which prosecution or civil claims are barred. The period begins when the offense occurs or, in limited cases, when discovered. Expiration generally prevents legal proceedings, even when evidence exists. Certain offenses, however, remain exempt from any such boundary. Treason, defined constitutionally as levying war against the United States or adhering to enemies while giving them aid and comfort, carries no statute of limitations as a capital offense. Murder, defined as unlawful killing with malice aforethought, similarly has no statute of limitations for capital or first-degree forms. Child abuse exhibits differentiated treatment, with medical and coercive forms against minors receiving elimination or substantial extension of limitations periods because of delayed disclosure patterns and long-term harms. The integration of malum in se and radical evil into jurisprudential analysis supports the event-specific framework for COVID crimes. This framework treats the pandemic response as encompassing crimes within crimes. Each aspect generates conspiratorial initiation, direct acts, and spillover effects that align with treason, murder, and child abuse. The resulting designations ensure that acts committed under the parameters of the pandemic receive labels that carry no statute of limitations. This structure maintains the philosophical imperative of perpetual accountability while providing precise delineation for complex, overlapping criminal activity involving mask mandates and vaccine policies throughout the response. The event-specific jurisprudential framework for COVID crimes. The framework designates the COVID pandemic as a COVID crime containing conspiracy, direct acts, and spillover effects. The pandemic encompasses conspiracy to amplify parameters through policy shifts and funding over many years. Direct acts include specific policies, mandates, and interventions that constituted the focal criminal conduct. Spillover effects encompass persistent harms, secondary crimes, and overlapping activity that flowed from the initial event. The framework labels all three layers as COVID treason, COVID murder, or COVID child abuse. The sequential nature of the pandemic response ensures that crimes within crimes remain interconnected. Conspiracy to initiate the COVID response involves long-term networks operating at community, national, and global levels. These networks prepared infrastructure through policy shifts, ideological alignment, and institutional coordination. Direct acts within the pandemic include policies, mandates, and interventions that constituted the focal criminal conduct. Spillover effects encompass persistent harms and secondary effects that merged with broader societal impacts. The framework labels all three layers uniformly under the imprescriptible categories. No statute of limitations applies to any act labeled under the framework. Perpetual accountability arises directly from the imprescriptible nature of the designated crimes. The structure acknowledges that real crimes occurred within the pandemic and received practical immunity due to surrounding circumstances. The event-specific labels provide precise delineation while maintaining no statute of limitations. This framework addresses the full scope of conspiracy, direct acts, spillover, and activity across the COVID response, including mask mandates and vaccine policies. The designations of COVID crime, together with their treason, murder, and child abuse variants, establish a unified jurisprudential mechanism for addressing the pandemic as imprescriptible offenses. Protected rhetorical designations of COVID criminals. The framework permits identification of participants through generalized rhetorical designations that function as protected political opinion. The term COVID criminal serves as a broad label for those involved in pushing mandates, restrictions, and policies viewed as unconstitutional overreach and harmful centralization of power. This designation applies to officials, experts, and bureaucrats in a manner that remains figurative and subjective. Courts treat such labels as rhetorical hyperbole or loose opinion in the context of heated political debate over public policies. The designation does not clearly imply a specific verifiable criminal act, but operates as exaggerated criticism of government actions. Qualifiers such as statements framed as personal belief strengthen the protected status of these designations. The label COVID criminal ties directly to policy criticism without detailing specific felonies. This approach lowers legal risk compared to narrower accusations while allowing sharp identification of responsible parties. The First Amendment provides strong protection for such terms when aimed at public officials or figures involved in pandemic policies. The designation maintains wide latitude in opinion pieces, commentary, or public discourse. Rhetorical designations enable precise identification of actors while remaining within protected speech boundaries. The framework treats these labels as part of the event-specific structure without crossing into unprotected categories. Context of robust political discourse on public health crises receives broad breathing room under constitutional safeguards. These designations ensure comprehensive coverage of all parameters, networks, and overlapping activity without temporal extinguishment while preserving the ability to name participants in the COVID response. Offenses in COVID mask mandates across participant categories. Government officials and politicians imposed prolonged mask mandates that centralized authority and restricted rights. These mandates constituted COVID treason through power grabs that undermined constitutional principles of bodily autonomy and free movement. Deprivation of rights under color of law occurred via selective enforcement that violated assembly and livelihood protections. COVID murder and reckless endangerment arose from policies causing oxygen deprivation and bacterial buildup, leading to foreseeable harms. Coercion and duress manifested in threats of fines, closures, and arrests for noncompliance. False statements accompanied public claims of high efficacy despite internal awareness of limitations. Public health officials and bureaucrats coordinated the enforcement of mask mandates while suppressing contrary evidence. COVID treason emerged from attacks on scientific inquiry and constitutional order through censorship of efficacy debates. Conspiracy to deprive civil rights involved coordination to remove skeptical content. COVID child abuse and negligence resulted from forcing masks on children despite documented developmental and psychological damage. Fraud and false statements appeared in repeated assertions that masks were highly effective. Harassment and coercion included shaming campaigns labeling non-compliant individuals as threats to public safety. Pharmaceutical companies, mainstream media, big tech platforms, hospitals, and educational officials supported and enforced mask mandates in alignment with broader policy goals. Fraud and wire fraud occurred through profiteering that sustained fear narratives to complement other interventions. Conspiracy and corruption involved lobbying for complementary policies. Medical malpractice and gross negligence took place in clinical enforcement without disclosure of risks. Battery and lack of informed consent affected patients and staff required to comply. COVID child abuse manifested in school settings through prolonged masking that ignored low-risk data and caused learning and mental health harms. Coercion and duress appeared in institutional threats of exclusion or job loss for noncompliance. Offenses in COVID vaccine mandates and vaccinations across participant categories. Government officials and politicians enforced vaccine mandates that overrode bodily autonomy and equal protection. COVID treason occurred through unconstitutional power grabs that undermined constitutional order. COVID murder and involuntary manslaughter resulted from mandates causing excess deaths while suppressing natural immunity data. Deprivation of rights under color of law involved firing employees or denying services for refusal. Coercion and duress took the form of job loss, school exclusion, and travel bans. Conspiracy to defraud the United States accompanied overriding expert panels for political acceleration of approvals. Public health officials and bureaucrats promoted vaccine mandates despite emerging signals of harm. COVID treason arose from suppression of natural immunity and alternative information to enable mandates. Perjury and false statements to Congress involved misleading testimony on efficacy and safety. Conspiracy to censor included pressuring platforms to remove critical content. Negligence and reckless endangerment stemmed from promoting mandates while overruling advisory committees. COVID murder manifested in policies that critics linked to unnecessary deaths through unaddressed adverse events. Pharmaceutical companies, mainstream media, big tech platforms, hospitals, and educational officials advanced vaccine mandates and vaccinations through coordinated actions. Fraud and wire fraud involved misrepresentation of efficacy and safety in applications and marketing. Crimes against humanity-style experimentation occurred through rushing products under emergency authorization without full informed consent. Conspiracy to censor suppressed injury reports and efficacy failures. Medical malpractice and gross negligence appeared in administration under financial incentives while ignoring contraindications. Battery and lack of informed consent affected staff and patients mandated without risk disclosure. COVID child abuse took place in school policies pushing interventions on minors despite emerging risks and lack of transmission benefit. Profiteering and corruption influenced regulators for liability shields while downplaying harms. Conclusion: a legal framework examining COVID policies and justice. The jurisprudential framework of event-specific crimes provides a coherent structure for addressing the COVID pandemic through designations that carry perpetual accountability. The pandemic functions as a crime in and of itself while generating conspiratorial planning, direct criminal acts, and spillover effects. The designations of COVID treason, COVID murder, and COVID child abuse ensure no statute of limitations attaches to any act within the response, including mask mandates and vaccine policies. This structure delineates crimes within crimes and criminals within those crimes with precision across all participant categories. The philosophical foundations of malum in se and radical evil support this approach by identifying acts that demand accountability beyond temporal boundaries. The statute of limitations analysis confirms that treason, murder, and child abuse occupy imprescriptible categories when elements are met. The constitutional parameters of treason provide the textual basis for labeling coordinated acts within the pandemic as event-specific offenses. Protected rhetorical designations such as COVID criminal allow identification of participants while remaining within First Amendment safeguards for political speech. This framework maintains perpetual accountability for the full chain of activity across the COVID response. It addresses the complete scope of conspiracy, direct acts, spillover, and overlapping activity in mask mandates and vaccine policies without temporal extinguishment. The designations establish a unified jurisprudential mechanism for the entire pandemic as imprescriptible offenses, ensuring comprehensive coverage of all parameters, networks, and harms.